Good morning, Wabash. Thank you. Speaking at chapel today is President Gregory Hess. Gregory Hess became the 16th president of Wabash College in the summer of 2013. Since then, he has thoughtfully articulated the value of a liberal arts education for men while leading the college through strategic planning processes that will shape the course of this institution through his tenure. Prior to his tenure here at Wabash, Dr. Hess was the Dean of Faculty and Vice President of Academic Affairs at Claremont McKenna College in Claremont, California. He is a native of San Francisco. He earned his bachelor's degree with high honors from the University of California, Davis, and his master's degree and Ph.D. in economics from Johns Hopkins University. He and his wife, Lora, are the parents of two daughters, Abigail and Meredith. Here giving his talk titled Trial and Mostly Error, President Gregory Hess.
Thank you very much, Abigail. Thank you very much, Hezekiah. Good morning, Wabash. And let me start off by giving my dad a happy birthday. Today's my dad's 86th birthday, so I wish I could be with you, Dad, but we'll see each other pretty soon. Well, my talk today is called Trial and Mostly Error. And I chose that topic because we are in the learning business, understanding and experimentation. Trial and error. Trial and error is one of the most basic approaches to learning. Interestingly, our basic understanding of learning involves error and failure, not success. Actually, when I think of my own experiences, it is more likely defined by trial and mostly error, which is why I gave this talk, this particular title. Try though we may, errors will always be our greatest source of understanding. So let's get used to it. We fail, and we fail a lot. And that's how we learn. However, our desire to mitigate errors and the consequences from errors seem larger now than ever before. We live in a time period where errors seem to matter more and seem to be that much larger. There are probably some reasons for that. The first is that uncertainty is rising. Errors seem larger. And the next is that the costs and consequences of those same errors also seem larger. So we're essentially hit by two complementary effects. And there are lots of reasons why this might be true. Uncertainty is growing, and the consequences from uncertainty are growing. The first is the kind of general, kind of gestalt of anxiety that's out there. Economic anxiety. Will people be able to, feed their families? Political anxiety. We've just gone through elections. We're going through elections soon. We seem to have just been spending a lot of time worrying about elections in other countries now, more than we ever have before. And there's cultural anxiety. Things are changing. There are people trying to create change and people trying to resist change, and that level of anxiety just seems to be rising out there. The next reason why I think errors are so big now and why we think so much about errors is that we're more integrated now than ever before. If our financial crisis taught us anything, and I'm sometimes I'm concerned it taught us anything, is that we are deeply systematically linked. Something that happens in one area quickly moves to another area, primarily because the interlinkages across activities is so strong. I think another reason why errors mean so much now, and we spend so much time thinking about errors and the consequences of errors, is because of technology. And I always tell my young daughters that technology is not your friend. It is a great way to be found, coming out short on some metric, and that technology is something that you need to be very careful of. When somebody breaks out a phone, starts taking pictures, starts taking videos, that is usually the clue to stop doing whatever you are doing. And social media and Google are not your friends. You can type a name and some spicy words, and those things last a very long time, although, truth be told, there's moves afoot, particularly in Europe, to make that a little bit harder. Our errors The question is, how long are they our errors? Do we have, the ability to collectively forget? So errors are important to us, and so we have to find a way to process them. I mean, it's called trial and error. We try something, we err, we have to try again. And so how do we process these errors? And how do we, in some ways, reduce these errors? Unless you believe that there's just a constant level of error out there in the world, that if you squeeze too much in one area, it's like a tube of toothpaste, just moves somewhere else. I don't really believe in the fixed value of error in society. So we make errors, and we're trying to squeeze those errors down. How do we make that happen? So in today's chapel talk, I want to focus on one particular approach that people have taken to try to reduce the number of errors that they create. And in so doing, this person wrote, I think, a very compelling, very interesting book. And it's called The Checklist Manifesto. It's a red book. I know a firm in Indy that hands it out to all their employees when they get there. Interestingly enough, turns out that not everybody's read it, but that's a much different story, and one I'll have to tell offline. But the author of this book is a gentleman named Atul Gawande. He's a seriously interesting individual. He's a surgeon, MacArthur Genius Fellow, a very successful author of many books, and a staff writer for The New Yorker. This gentleman is no slacker. He is exceptionally thoughtful and a very compelling public intellectual. And in fact, the book I'm talking about is his prior book. His new book is called Being Mortal. And if you go to any of the bookstores out there, it's one of the top-selling books out there, trying to, take his knowledge about what it's like to be a surgeon in terms of trying to help people understand their mortality. But his Checklist Manifesto book was very compelling reading, and it was very influential on how people have approached trying to reduce problems. So I'm going to come up with my very simple takeaway from the books. I've not read any reviews of the book. I read it myself. It's usually a check I always do, both as an academic, as an individual. Whenever I do something, I always write my review first. I never read other people's reviews, lest it overly influence my opinion. But here's some big takeaways from it. The first is that, in his view, you can kind of capture failures or errors in two particular ways. The first one is failure of ignorance. So there's some things we don't know, and so because of that, we could fail or create an error because we just don't have the knowledge base. The second type of failure is something called failure of ineptitude, which is you actually do know the right thing to do, you just didn't execute. You just didn't get it done. And so that's just kind of paradigm, and I'm not trying to be too uncharitable, but I'm trying to reduce this in my own checklist down to just a couple of things. And his kind of further point there is that, look, there are these two errors. There's ignorance and there's ineptitude, and science has given us a lot of knowledge now. So science can teach us a lot. I'm not sure he'll say it can teach us everything, but it can teach us a lot, which means that failures of ignorance have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller through time, and failures of ineptitude are really all that's left. So he's going to go after ineptitude with a checklist. That's essentially the 15-second review of it. And he's got, he has some great examples in there. And they're very interesting examples because, and he's a very persuasive writer. And it's very interesting. The first one he talks about is central line infection. So when people need a central line installed, as part of some kind of cardiac procedure. Now, these are very critical things in very difficult moments in people's critical care. And what's so interesting is that he finds that oftentimes infections from central lines are pervasive. It happens all the time. And he's a surgeon, and obviously surgeons, there's nothing good about getting an infection from a central line being inserted. So his view was, well, we just need to come up with a checklist to make this work. And obviously, we've got to take this checklist and work this checklist and rework this checklist so that everybody knows here are the things you need to do in order to reduce infections from central lines. And in fact, he shows evidence. He does these tests. He's a very persuasive person. He shows that in hospitals you can reduce these infections manyfold just by coming up with a simple checklist. Here's another example he gives, and it's a very poignant example given what's currently happened over the last few days in a flight between Germany and Spain. His other example he talks a lot about, and it's a big chunk of the book, is about airplane crashes. How do you avoid mistakes in airplanes? And he spends a lot of time, goes to Boeing, spends several days in Boeing. This guy was a surgeon full time, so I don't know how he breaks the bounds of 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But he's out in Boeing going through checklists, and they have these big books of checklists. Whenever this happens, open a page, whatever, and do these following things. Just a magnificent thing. And he talks a lot about how in certain key instances, when people have been flying planes, they've been able in real time to open up this checklist and figure out how to land the plane, even under very difficult circumstances. And it's benefited by the fact that planes, maybe not like other parts of life, have flight simulators. So you can actually simulate this in the plane. And to the extent you get that right, you can rework and rework and rework. And of course, just like central lines, there's no benefit from an infection from a central line. Turns out, there's no benefit from a plane crash either. So here's a place where, everyone is unifocused. Let's use this checklist to work on ineptitude. And it's a very compelling read. He has a kind of a whole kind of story on what's a good checklist, And so this is like his checklist for his checklist, just to get you there. And I'm reducing a full-page checklist to just a few points. The first is that it's got to be crisp. There's nothing like a 20-page checklist. If you're in a plane and you want to try to find out what's wrong when the light flashes and you pull out your protocol, you don't want to be reading a novel, right? You need to be reductionist, which means you got to try to find the essential features. Sometimes you can get that right and sometimes you can get that wrong, but you got to reduce it down. And that's one of the problems we'll talk about. How do you pick exactly which ones to go for? A good checklist needs to be logical. It needs to actually follow logic. It needs to actually give you time for corrective action. There's no real use to give you a checklist which doesn't allow you to actually correct the problem. If the light goes on and you're trying to save the plane, it doesn't really help to say, gosh, it's going to take you 5 minutes to get everything done, and you only have 1 minute until the problem happens. So you have to make sure that there's some time available there in order to allow for the corrective action. And then he also talks about the more complex the task, the more communication that needs to happen, and that teamwork is a key, and that as you look through different things, he talks about the example of Hurricane Katrina and how a better response could be brought about during Hurricane Katrina in terms of the response that the U.S. government gave. It's that sometimes you have to allow for decentralization. In fact, one of the great decentralizers during Katrina, some of the people who did the most service, was Walmart, because they gave full authority to everybody in Walmart to do whatever they needed to benefit the people who were hurt, including when hospitals needed drugs that they didn't have. The people who managed the Walmart just broke into the pharmacy and distributed all the drugs they had in order to move situation around. Finally, there's the timestamp. You always have to revisit your timeline. And as I said, this is a pretty intense checklist of checklists that's in the appendix. Now, checklists are good things, especially when we're talking about ineptitude. And what's interesting is that checklists have, in some sense, maybe I'm being a little uncharitable here, but it's my chapel talk, so that's okay, in some ways the checklist manifesto has manifested itself a little bit in higher education. One of the ways, and once again, I'm not an expert in this area, nor do I claim to be, and there are some pros and cons of this, but one area where that kind of checklist mentality has been applied to higher education is in competency-based education. The premise is that students, education should be competency-dependent, not time-dependent. If there's a list of things you need to do in order to prove that you know all the material, you shouldn't have to show up every day, Monday through Friday, 8 in the morning, to get this done. If you know it and you can do it in 2 days a week rather than 1 day, rather than 3 days a week, you should be able to do it. It should be time dependent. When you master all the skills, you should be able to check the box. You should be done. So it's interesting. They make a list of skills that need to be mastered, and when it's mastered, it's mastered. Learning can be asynchronous. You don't have to always pair up in time. You can do it when you have the chance. And prior experience counts. So if you learned a lot of this stuff in some other part, or you read the book before you got there, you can just speed through. Now, there's some evidence that this works in the small for the individual in areas where education is very directed and perhaps very narrow. And you have to ask yourself more broadly, is the checklist approach appropriate for higher education? So now, as I indicated, except for kind of what I call narrow skill-based education, what we know and how we apply education, and how we think about academics, it's particularly tangled to think about how a checklist can work more comprehensively. Because the fact of the matter, it isn't large. If you think about not just the individual skill building stuff that individuals have to do in a narrow sense, think about higher education as a whole, or what I call in the large. Ignorance and ineptitude are often what economists call observationally equivalent. People being inept and people being ignorant in higher education are oftentimes the same thing, or at least appear to be the same thing. Here's a good example. If you dial back many, many years, a common medical treatment to cure illnesses were blood-sucking leeches. That was what people did in order to help cure people from certain diseases. That was the knowledge base. You could always say, well, if the leeches didn't work, it wasn't that the leeches weren't working, just that you had applied the wrong way. People kind of substituted what was ultimately found to be their ignorance with rather ineptitude. No, you just didn't put enough leeches on, you didn't put them in the right place. So it turns out, though, if you look in history, there are many times when we didn't know what we thought we knew. And oftentimes what people said was, in fact, ineptitude was really our own ignorance. Now, this observational equivalence in higher ed could be due to a number of factors, and I'll talk about a few of them, and I'll try to do it reasonably briefly. The first one is that in any field of academics, one of the things that every part of education and the intellectual growth of knowledge is subject to is orthodoxy in higher ed. And so when it comes to thinking about what is it that an individual needs to master in a particular area, you have to think about, well, what is that checklist? Who's writing that checklist? And who is actually asking the questions that generate this checklist? And what you find oftentimes in higher education is that personality, fashion, and hubris have a much larger role in academics than you can ever believe. And I say that having been an academic and remaining to be an academic for a lot of years. There is a very strong gravitational pull oftentimes in higher education to have what some people call groupthink, or to have a singular moment where everybody seems to collide onto looking at problems in a very simple and singular way. And if you're an academic and you're trying to make progress ahead, there's a huge temptation to be part of the in crowd. And that could be, so they're just like there's peer pressure in life, and they tell you all about that and all those things that happened to you in high school. There is definitely peer pressure in higher ed and ways for you to pick teams. Now, if you're smart, it's good to be a contrarian sometime too, and we'll get to being a contrarian a little bit later. But make no mistake, the challenge of orthodoxy in higher education is a huge temptation. To allow it to create a checklist of competency means that in some ways that orthodoxy has a new opportunity here in order to decide exactly what needs to be known, how it needs to be known, and to have that be, in some sense, unquestioned, which is deeply against the grain of higher education. So, as I said, one opportunity or one way to think about how this observational equivalence, how ignorance and ineptitude can be confused, is not just the orthodoxy problem, but it's also due to something that is loosely referred to as the streetlight effect. And this is something that many disciplines talk about. In economics, I learned about it. And the story goes something like this. There's a guy, and it's always a guy for some reason, who's lost his keys, right? And, a policeman walks up to him, and, the guy's been drinking, and he says, well, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm looking for my keys. And the officer says, well, where did you lose them? And the person says, well, I don't know where I lost them. They're lost. And so then the policeman asks, well, why are you looking under the lamp? The lamppost for your keys if you don't know where you lost them. He says, well, this is the only place where there's light, so this is where I got to look for them. So oftentimes we are looking for our keys in the wrong area because of all different opportunities to see things incorrectly. Sometimes they call it myopia or wrong-sightedness. You can be short-sighted, you can be long-sighted. Sometimes you just don't see what's in front of you. And that can happen for several reasons. First of all, it could be a totally new phenomenon, something that you've never experienced before, which is a topic that Milton Friedman talked a lot about in his use of economics, where sometimes people would take a theory or some empirics that applied to one era and then try to apply it to a completely different era. And his view was that, well, if you fit the data over this region, it may actually not extend into a whole different set of phenomena. So the whole first thing you have to worry about in the streetlight effect is this totally new phenomenon. The other thing is that we've not recently seen this. So it could be something that's happened back in history, but it's just that it's been forgotten. We can't remember everything. Much of the lessons that we learned about in the most recent financial crisis, a lot of them were learned during the Great Depression. And there are a lot of Great Depression scholars out there. Certainly in economics, including Ben Bernanke, who happened to be the Federal Reserve, the head of the Board of Governors at the time. And that actually helped us quite a bit, his knowledge of that. On the other hand, we got pretty close to the edge before some of that knowledge kicked in. And so not only, could it be new phenomena or that it's, recent, it's not just phenomena that we haven't observed for a very long period of time, or it could be that we just learned the wrong lesson last time we learned it. And that's oftentimes true because, once again, we talked about this observational equivalence between ineptitude and ignorance. And so when you observe a mistake, it's hard to know, is it because we didn't know it or is it because we applied things wrong? That sorting out can influence even future mistakes. So here's, it's been a while. You guys have never heard me be cranky about the Fed, so today's my day to be cranky about the Fed a little bit. And some of you know it who've taken intermediate macro, and it's a view that I've pushed for a while. A lot of people who've taken intermediate macro know about the Taylor rule. In fact, last year when I guest lectured for Professor Mikek, I talked about the Taylor rule. And what's very interesting is how the Taylor rule has ebbed and flowed over the last 20 years. John Taylor came up with a Taylor rule in 1993. And it was a way that he could show how he could predict what Alan Greenspan was going to do. That was a simple little article, how Alan Greenspan did it. And he showed that it had some really nice features. It showed how he could generate inflation and kind of output, or if you don't want to think about output, you can think about unemployment. And it was kind of like a very small checklist to show that his rule was kind of keeping us in a good space. Now, one of the issues that's kind of interesting is that he did this over a period of prosperity. And that's one of the things we talk about. He applied the Taylor rule, and he learned about the Taylor rule during a period of good times. Didn't learn about it so much until periods of bad times. We learned about that recently. And the nice thing about the rule is that it followed the Fed's dual mandate, which is to be good about inflation and to be good on output and unemployment. But what happened in academics is this thing became an absorbing state. This is the only thing people in macroeconomics talked about for about 15 years. I mean, it took over everything. I left the Fed around the time this paper was written, and I came back from England, and the whole literature had switched from Taylor rule, everything was a Taylor rule. And the Taylor rule is very informative because under the right circumstances, it can be quite important. But the Taylor rule is not supposed to explain all monetary policy or all central banking. In fact, one of the things the Taylor rule doesn't really talk a lot about at all is financial institutions, financial intermediation, and all the things that go with the health of financial intermediation, which means how borrowers and savers intermediate funds through a whole network of firms and institutions, both government and private. And it turned out that because the whole field had just collapsed onto this one topic, they completely ignored issues of financial health, financial intermediation, what was happening with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And it really led the entire discipline in the wrong direction. So what did the Fed learn this time? Well, some believe that the Fed learned the wrong lesson. We have a period of extended low interest rates. We've had massive quantitative easing. And while the Fed still continues to look at inflation and unemployment very carefully, and we all look at every little word they say, there are many who believe that the Fed has created imbalances that are inconsistent with healthy financial intermediation. And if you recall, what happened that caused the last crisis was financial intermediation. It wasn't inflation and unemployment. So the fact that everybody's focusing on the thing that wasn't the problem seems kind of unusual to me. So what do we need out there? Well, here's something that most presidents will probably never say in a speech, which is the things that are important in academic are things like dissent and creativity. Presidents might say that. They won't say dissent. But what we need is dissent, creativity, and imagination. These are potential solutions to orthodoxy and myopia-induced errors that can emerge from any kind of checklist. So, we've got these monopolistic hold on ideas out there, and these need to be arbitraged by criticism. Now, it turns out that criticism and dissent is certainly no guarantee for clarity, but its absence is no guarantee either that we're going to be successful in our outcomes. And if you think about generally what the liberal arts tries to do, basically, I think of the liberal arts sometimes as just an inquiry into incompetence and ignorance, the same type of errors that the book, The Checklist Manifesto, is so actively trying to go after. And I've used this line before, so please apologize for hearing it again. If you think about what happens in literature, right? There are no books of there are no journals of literary praise, right? There are only journals of literary criticism. And much of what we value in education is about that dialogue. It's not just about the checklist at the end. Now, there are other ways to kind of, dissent and creativity and imagination are great ways to overcome some of these errors of orthodoxy and the street lamp effect. Leadership is also a channel for abating errors, or as it turns out, making them a lot worse. Getting things right is the subtitle to the book, The Checklist Manifesto. It's The Checklist Manifesto, Getting Things Right. And that kind of limits its ability to talk to people about what's important. Because one of the things that I talk about in discerning the difference between management and leadership is that management is all about doing things right. Leadership is all about doing the right thing. And sometimes it's very hard when you're thinking about problems, you're thinking about checklists and how do I try and run an organization or run a process that doesn't have a lot of errors. Sometimes it's very hard to come up and do the right thing in certain circumstances. Now, the book always talks about examples when there's only one possibly preferred outcome. And that is, we want to reduce infection. Who doesn't want to reduce infection? How about plane crashes? Well, who doesn't want to, reduce plane crashes? But sometimes the goals are competing. And sometimes you have to ask yourself, who is determining these goals? How do we identify those goals? What if I said, okay, I want you to write a checklist for Middle East peace? How would you do it? Or if I said, let's make a checklist for determining if we should have a Democrat or Republican as the president in 2016. Well, immediately there are going to be two camps, and nobody's going to be able to agree, and suddenly I'm not sure if that's because we have ignorance, is somebody, using the wrong policies, or somebody just not executing the right policies right. Once again, we're in that kind of mystery world of are we ignorant or are we just inept? There are no promises, however, with leadership. Leadership's job is to try to help you think through your goals and to do the right thing and find ways to create an opportunity to set a checklist. But there's no promises there. At my prior institution, my last stop, as I sometimes call it, my last stop, one of the big topics they had was, well, how do we talk about being leadership in the global world? A good friend of mine who's German and really looked askance at this whole idea about leadership in a global world. My friend Manfred stood up. He says, well, that's very important to Germany. In fact, that's why we called it Führership in Germany, which pretty much ended the conversation about the role that leadership in a global world could bring at my last stop. He's a good friend, but made an important point. Leadership can get you to the right spot, but there are no guarantees. Now, for those of you who know me, you know that I myself, so here I am, I've kind of railed against checklists for a while and how it's reduced errors, but those of you who know me know that I do have kind of my own checklist, and I have my own kind of rules. So I've been trying to think about that. Anybody here who's a freshman that I rung in knows that I have my 4 gets not to forget. I won't quiz you. In fact, this will be a cheat sheet. I won't make this a t-shirt yet, but let's remind ourselves what the 4 rules are. One is get to work, get involved, get to sleep, get help. It's actually not a bad freshman checklist, but it's probably got some errors that, and it's certainly not meant to be a complete list. It can certainly, it sometimes gets you in the wrong direction. Those of you who are on the senior staff know that I have my own checklist. I usually don't play this card, but I'll tell you what my checklist is. Senior staff, because we've recently hired a person senior staff, I just told them, here's the checklist. First one, no prima donnas. Everybody can staple. You know, if all hands are on deck, everybody can staple. Second, no public surprises. You know, if there's a surprise, I don't want to hear about it in front of a room of 50 people. Don't want to hear in front of the board, don't want to hear about it in front of faculty. Say, if there's a surprise, tell me beforehand. And we'll try to make it a lot less of a surprise, and we'll do a quick huddle up. A third one is no I, me, or mine. Always we, us, our. We're in this together. And finally, I do try to distribute out as much decision-making authority to the people I work with as I possibly can. So my rule is called, if you say it, I say it, which means that if somebody who reports to me says something, that's kind of like me saying something, which actually is a pretty good check on them because they got to make sure that we're in alignment when they say it, and hopefully they do. And if it doesn't happen, well, we have a little conversation, but it's a lot easier than me having to try and say everything. Now, these rules are not meant to be comprehensive, and they involve a lot of ambiguity. This is not meant to be one of these comprehensive checklists, and it probably wouldn't. I mean, it's simple. Maybe it's overly simple from the view of the book Checklist Manifesto. But it's partly because there's always an unstated rule that's out there. And that's basically that there are no sufficient conditions for success in any endeavor, and that there will always be errors. And that ultimately there's no checklist that provides you a guarantee. Wow, that's kind of heavy. But there are no sufficient conditions. But I will tell you this. In my life, there are a couple of what I call principles or touchstones, and that I've, basically when I take a broad view of what I think has made people both personally successful and professionally successful, that I always try to emphasize. And so this is kind of also my little checklist. And these are 2 conditions, and they are not sufficient conditions. This will never erase every error that you have. But these are the things, people who have been successful privately, publicly, in any endeavor that they take, that they engage in, but they provide no guarantee, no sufficient condition for success. And those 2 are to set your expectations high and to work hard. I have never met a person who's accomplished great things who has not done those 2 things. And here's what drew me to Wabash College. Because I like to think that Wabash College has its own kind of short set of checklists or rules, or what I call touchstones. And they aren't perfect. And they involve ambiguity. And failure from these touchstones, these principles, do bring opportunities for education. And I like to think that those 2 touchstones that we harp on so much make us what is truly distinctive at Wabash College. These are the things that make us unique and make us successful. First thing is that we're an honor college. And that is articulated in the gentleman's rule, which asks people to set their expectations high, to be leaders, and to do the right thing. As understood by a term gentleman, which, Dean Raters can wax eloquently on. At my last stop, this was not the case. I've actually become very fond of honor colleges, and I'll tell you why. At my last stop, like many colleges, almost every college out there has a really large, thick rule book. I'd say it's the do's and don'ts, but there's hardly a few do's in there. It's almost all don'ts, right? It's like... And they involve a lot of attorney involvement, a lot of hourly rates billed in 6-minute increments. And the way I think about it is that if, and a lot of colleges run with a lot of lawyers right now. And my view is if all you have are hammers, then everything's going to start looking like a nail. And that just means that colleges right now have become very inwardly focused on running a type of institution that, where it's very reactive, very don't-oriented, and makes it very difficult to run the type of whole student formation that we try to do here at Wabash. So at Wabash, we set the bar high. You're asked to be a gentleman and responsible citizen, both on and off campus, at all times. And that's a great mark to set your life by. The second piece is mojo, right? So we've got our honor college. You know, we have the gentleman's rule. We have our mojo, and it really became crystal clear how important this was to me when I was at the gym, which I haven't been to enough recently. I know some people pointed that out. I went into the gym not too long ago, and one retired faculty member said, "Oh, you should use the machine because you haven't been here recently." That's what he said to me. I was like, all right, okay. So here I am. It was still pretty quiet in there, and there's a student in there named Austin Jameson. I don't know if Austin's here or not. I didn't give him any heads up. And we're watching, I was working out, we're watching wrestling. He's got wrestling on every screen. He's a retired wrestler, I think is what Brian said. He's a retired wrestler, and he's helping out as a manager there. And he was working in the facility, and we were watching Iowa, I think it was Iowa versus Penn State in wrestling. It was on TV. It was every single TV had that on and that only, and I'm pretty game for most sports. And we're watching it, and this Penn State guy had this Iowa guy pinned to the ground. It was on, this guy was going nowhere. His stomach was on the ground, and this other guy was on top of him, and nothing was moving for a long period of time. And so, you know, after watching this for many minutes, or what seemed like many minutes, I turned to Austin. I said, "So, what do you do when you're pinned on your stomach for that long, right? This can't be a winning strategy, right? And he said something really funny, and very reactive. He says, "Well, you're not going to win like that. You're not going to win down there. You have to do everything to get back up." And that was his line. And he didn't have a rule. He just said, "You're not going to win down there. You got to get up." And basically, that to me was very much the spirit of Wabash Always Fights. It was the spirit that you always have to work hard, and that nothing is given to you. And when you're down, you have to get back up. So let's face the facts, everybody. We're going to fail. We're going to fail a lot. Get used to it, but don't make it a habit. Expect it, but don't be defined by it. Ride the wave, don't fight it, but don't accept it either. Simply make the most of it. And when you fall down, get back up. Set your sights high by always trying to be a gentleman. Thank you very much.